Crystal Court. Ussold's gossamer form shimmered as she swept into the crystal court of Etheria, her ethereal figure casting a gentle luminescence that illuminated the room despite its grand vaults and stained glass. The hall was cavernous, echoing with whispers of diplomatic protocol and ancient codes etched into starlight patterns on high walls. She moved gracefully among delegates from various planets and dimensions, each one paying homage to their highest judge. Ussold David Okonkwo stood at the opposite end of this vast chamber, his dark skin stark against the ethereal light that danced around him like a halo-less saint in an old painting. He wore Earth's ceremonial robes over a suit so tailored it was almost second skin. Everything about David said professionalism and distance. Yet, as Ussold approached with her usual deliberate purposefulness, he shifted uneasily, his eyes flickering towards the floor. The meeting convened, each delegate taking their place like actors on an immense stage, every movement choreographed to show respect or status. The room was filled with a faint aroma of space, dust, and polished stone, sounds muted by thick carpets, but for the occasional cough or rustle of fabric as dignitaries settled into chairs shaped from crystal. Ussold's voice rang out like distant thunder when she addressed the gathering honorable delegates of our interstellar union. We convene today to discuss matters crucial to all worlds represented herein. Her translucent form seemed to shimmer more intensely, radiating a serene authority that commanded attention. David listened intently from afar, but his eyes kept darting around, never resting on any single point for long, especially not Ussold's piercing gaze. It was an old habit of avoidance he had perfected over the years since becoming Earth's first permanent ambassador to Etheria. As discussions progressed and legal points were debated with meticulous detail, David could feel a nagging presence in his peripheral vision. Each time he tried to focus on anything else, Ussold's ethereal form would suddenly come into view, hovering just out of reach, but ever present like an unanswered question floating in the air. Finally, as formalities concluded and delegates began filing out for refreshments, David made a hasty exit from his assigned seating area. Yet before he could escape completely through one of many archways leading to private chambers or meeting halls beyond, Ussold blocked his path with effortless grace, her flowing form seeming almost transparent yet impenetrable. "Ambassador," she said in tones that left no room for refusal, "you have been avoiding my gaze today. You leave rooms when I enter them." David stopped dead, a flicker of something, perhaps discomfort or resignation, flashing across his features before he schooled his expression back into placid neutrality. He cleared his throat and replied diplomatically, "High Arbiter Ussold, you are kind to notice such things about me. As for today's session, my attention was focused on the matters at hand." Her eyes seemed to narrow slightly, though whether from suspicion or curiosity was impossible to tell without seeing their depths directly. "I can sense emotion," she replied softly but firmly, "and your avoidance here is not out of disrespect. It's something else entirely, an internal struggle so powerful it's loud." David shifted his weight uneasily, the ring on his finger catching light as he glanced down at it briefly before meeting her gaze again. There was a moment where they stared each other down, silent words passing between them like breath across water, an unspoken tension and shared understanding. Ussold pressed further without hesitation now that she had David's attention fully captured. "Your silence speaks volumes to me," she continued gently yet insistently, "but you will not reveal what it means unless I make this official court inquiry." David blinked once before his face turned stony, Again, he knew there was no way out of answering directly in front of everyone now. She made her decision known, Ambassador Okonkwo, she declared loudly, enough for others to hear. I hereby request that you respond publicly and truthfully as part of today's session. Your reasons for avoiding me must be understood by all. David's jaw clenched, but he nodded sharply in acceptance of what was unavoidable. The room fell silent again, even the usually boisterous corridors stilled with anticipation as delegates returned to gather around Ushold and David. The chapter ends exactly here, right after Ushold officially requests that Ambassador Okonkwo answer publicly why he avoids her during court sessions in Crystal Court. Ambassador David Okonkwo stood alone in his quarters, a room vast and empty like much of his heart these days. The walls were lined with holographic screens displaying the latest data from ethery delegates' maps, graphs, and endless streams of information necessary for diplomatic negotiation. Yet today's preparation as tinged with something far heavier than usual, memories of the past that seemed to flood back every time he entered this room. David glanced at his reflection in a large mirror hanging on one wall, a man who had aged gracefully, but whose soul felt as if it were still trapped somewhere between yesterday and tomorrow. His dark skin gleamed under the soft lights, his features sharp yet handsome in an understated way. He wore professional attire, formal enough to convey respect for this alien world's protocol, but beneath all that was a man who carried too much weight on his shoulders. He reached into one of the drawers by his desk and pulled out an old photo album, flipping through its pages with trembling fingers. Pictures from happier times flooded back, moments he had vowed never to let return after losing Mary 3 years ago. Her laughter in this room, where he now worked alone, their wedding day captured under the same light fixtures that shone above him today. A sudden knock on his door interrupted these painful recollections, and David sighed heavily before calling out a terse "Come in." The door swished open to reveal Marcus, a young aide, whose loyalty was unwavering, but sometimes overly zealous. Today, however, Marcus' expression hinted at something different, concern mixed with determination. "Sir," began Marcus without preamble, "you know what today entails. You can't keep avoiding High Arbiter Ushold forever." David looked up from the photo album and met his aide's eyes for a brief moment before turning away again to stare out over etherous crystal landscape beyond the window panes. "I am aware," David replied stiffly, his voice devoid of emotion, "and I have made my peace with facing her publicly once more." Marcus hesitated briefly, but then pressed forward nonetheless. "But why? Why do you think she will press this again today?" David turned back to face Marcus fully now, leaning heavily against the desk as if it were a crutch rather than merely an object of utility. "Because I am hiding something from Theme and myself," he admitted after several long seconds. Marcus's expression softened slightly, but did not waver entirely in its resolve. "And what is that, sir?" David's hand moved mechanically to touch the wedding band on his finger once more before answering quietly. "The truth will destroy my career, or it might set you free," Marcus countered softly yet firmly. There was no judgment in those words, only an undercurrent of understanding and perhaps sympathy. For a moment there was silence between them as David pondered this unexpected assertion from one so young but clearly perceptive regarding his struggles. Finally, he nodded slowly once more to himself rather than to Marcus before rising up straighter again. "Marcus," said David finally, with renewed determination in both voice and bearing, "let us prepare for today's session." There was no further discussion needed as they turned their focus back fully towards the day ahead while still carrying unspoken burdens within them. As preparations continued through various technical briefings, led by Marcus, and additional readings from diplomatic law books provided by other aides hovering nearby. David found himself distracted once more. His gaze kept wandering over to where one aide was setting up a small holographic display showing past sessions between him and Usolde, a reminder of what was about to happen yet again today. David's hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he forced himself to breathe deeply and center himself mentally rather than acting out physically against the growing pressure of expectation. He closed his eyes briefly, allowing memories both painful and beautiful wash over him before forcing them away with determination. When he opened them once more, they met Marcus' steady gaze, who had been watching quietly during this mental battle within David's mind, now visibly aware that today would indeed be different no matter how much either wanted it otherwise. There was a silent acknowledgment passing between them, understanding of heavy stakes and unspoken support. As final preparations were made, the door to his quarters slid open yet again, but instead of another aide bearing updates on data, analysis, or briefings regarding protocol, this time in stepped High Arbiter Usolde, herself, ethereal form shimmering softly against ambient lighting from outside, illuminating her flowing contours like stars trapped within translucent glass. Ambassador Okonkwo, she began without preamble, though clearly recognizing the tension brewing inside David as well. It seems today's discussions cannot proceed until we address certain unresolved questions. David took a deep breath and met Usolde's eyes squarely, feeling once more that unspoken connection forming despite their different natures. He knew there was no escaping this confrontation now. "High Arbiter," he replied formally, yet with an undercurrent of resignation. "I understand your concern, but I assure you nothing untoward has transpired." Usolde's form paused mid-trance. It then shifted slightly, almost as if considering his words, before answering delicately. "It is not about what has transpired, Ambassador," she explained gently, though firmly maintaining that piercing yet sympathetic gaze which seemed to see into one's very soul, "but rather why such avoidance continues when clearly there are emotions involved." David felt a chill run down his spine at the accuracy of her statement, even as he braced himself against admitting anything further. He glanced over momentarily towards Marcus, who stood silently by, now fully aware that today was indeed different in ways far beyond protocol or normal diplomatic exchanges. Just then Usolde's gaze shifted towards Marcus and back again, with an almost imperceptible nod indicating she had noticed his presence and understood the role he played here as well. "I can sense emotions," continued Usolde softly but decisively, "and your avoidance of me is not out of disrespect. It's something else entirely, an internal struggle so powerful it's loud." David took another deep breath, attempting to steady himself against this revelation, yet knowing full well she was right in every way. He felt Marcus shift behind him, almost imperceptibly providing silent support as Usolde pressed further. "Your silence speaks volumes," she stated gently yet insistently, "but you will not reveal what it means unless I make an official inquiry." There was no room for refusal here, despite how much David wished to avoid these questions once more. With a final nod of grim acceptance from Marcus and another deep breath in preparation for battle within the courtroom, David acknowledged her with a sharp, decisive gesture. "Very well," he conceded resolutely, though his voice still carried traces of reluctance. "But no, this is not easy for me." Usolde nodded once more, almost as if understanding yet unable to truly comprehend such complexity given their differing natures and experiences. "Then let us proceed accordingly then," she stated firmly before turning towards the door, already knowing that others had gathered outside waiting for exactly this moment of truth. Ambassador Okonkwo, you will respond publicly and fully in today's session. David felt a final wave of dread wash over him, but knew there was no other way now to confront what he avoided or risk everything further by continuing such deception even to himself. With one last look back towards Marcus, who nodded encouragingly, though clearly understanding that this would indeed be difficult for his superior, David stepped forward, following Ussold out into the awaiting courtroom, readying himself mentally and emotionally despite how much pain might come next. As they walked through silent corridors lined with glimmering crystals reflecting light in myriad hues against walls seemingly made of living stone, David felt a profound sense of dread mingled with resolve. The air was cool here, but not cold. A gentle breeze moved past them, carrying scents of distant gardens and serene waterfalls despite being deep within the fortress-like structure. They entered Crystal Court, an enormous space filled with floating platforms, serving as both audience seating areas along with more practical meeting spaces. Light filtered through ceiling-high windows above, creating a kaleidoscope effect across everything below. Yet in this grand setting today felt small yet immense. Personal confrontation broadcasts to all who mattered within ethery politics. Delegates already gathered here turned their attention towards them, immediately sensing the gravity of Ussold's decision, while David kept his eyes fixed ahead, meeting no one else's gaze, though feeling countless pairs watching intently regardless. His heart pounded heavily under official robes weighing down each step he took, yet also symbolizing pride and responsibility as Earth's representative amidst these ethereal beings. Ussold led them directly to her designated position within the main chamber, before turning fully towards David once more with that piercing but empathetic gaze, never faltering despite everything she was asking of him now. Ambassador Okonkwo, Ussold proclaimed loudly enough for all assembled to hear clearly, I hereby request that you respond publicly and truthfully as part of today's session regarding your reasons for avoiding me during our court sessions. David felt eyes upon them from every direction, yet met hers firmly, in turn silently, acknowledging the necessity of facing this head-on despite fears of what might come next. His jaw tightened momentarily before nodding sharply once more, accepting without question nor complaint. With that, David stepped forward onto designated platform while Ussold moved beside him, ready to guide proceedings according to ethery protocols, but also allowing him space to speak truthfully now at last, whatever form that might take amidst these ancient crystalline walls filled with alien intrigue and human sorrow. The room fell silent again. Then the usually boisterous corridors stilled with anticipation as delegates returned to gather around Ussold and David. David's breath hitched briefly before he turned fully towards assembled audience, meeting their expectant gazes despite deep-seated reluctance still lingering beneath surface professionalism. Yet there was no more time for avoiding truth here, no, a confrontation both necessary yet painful beyond measure awaited within these walls today. And he walks into the tribunal. Chapter 3 Tribunal. Ussold's voice carried across Crystal Court like a soft yet undeniable command, filling every corner of the vast chamber as she addressed David directly. Amidst the gathering crowd, the room was silent. Even the usual hum of alien activity seemed to have paused in anticipation. Please begin, Ussold said calmly, her eyes never leaving his face, despite the hundreds watching them closely from floating platforms around the perimeter. David took a deep breath, feeling the weight of Earth's diplomatic responsibilities on his shoulders. He straightened and turned toward the assembled delegates, his hands clasped behind him in readiness for whatever challenge lay ahead. The air was cool here, but not cold. A gentle breeze moved past, carrying scents of distant gardens and serene waterfalls despite being deep within this fortress-like structure. "I am David Okonkwo," he began formally, yet with a touch more urgency than usual given the gravity of his task now. "And I stand before you today because there are questions that need answering." Three delegates on floating platforms shifted slightly, their semi-translucent forms shimmering as if reflecting internal thought processes rather than mere movement. "Questions regarding your avoidance," Usold prompted softly yet firmly. She stood beside him, but maintained her distance, a respectful gesture allowing his personal space amidst the crowd's curiosity and judgmental eyes. "Yes," David replied steadily. "Hi, Arbiter Usold. I have been asked why I avoid you during our court sessions." The room was silent once more, even the usually boisterous corridors stilled with anticipation as delegates returned to gather around them closely now. "Your silence speaks volumes," a noble Etheri named Zetha spoke up from across the platform. His voice carried authority and curiosity blended into one challenging tone. "We want you to explain." David felt his heart rate increase, but forced himself to remain composed, drawing on years of diplomatic training to focus through this intense scrutiny. "Because among my people," he started slowly, each word carefully chosen yet carrying profound meaning behind them all, "we have a saying, don't look too long at the sun." The court murmured softly in response. It was an unexpected turn that sparked varied reactions ranging from curiosity to genuine concern for his well-being amidst their intense scrutiny. "But Ambassador Okonkwo," Usold spoke gently, her tone reflecting compassion, but also seeking deeper understanding within this complex situation. "You are a beacon of light yourself here among us. We avoid such radiance." David's eyes met hers briefly before he looked away again. It was an old habit honed by years of loss and the need to protect oneself from further pain. "You are made of starlight," David said quietly, choosing his words with care, "and centuries passed beneath your translucent form as a constant guide through time itself." The room fell silent yet more profoundly this moment. The weight of his statement resonated clearly, even without sound amplifying its impact among all present. "I am flesh and blood," he continued steadily, though still privately struggling to maintain composure given these circumstances, "and limited by the finite number of heartbeats that I possess in life's tapestry." His gaze shifted back momentarily towards Usold, whose starlit eyes seemed both puzzled yet also deeply thoughtful considering his words. "You are eternal here, your essence unchanged through millennia," David concluded softly but clearly, audible to all. His emotions were raw, unshielded for a moment beneath the layers of professional reserve he usually maintained so vigilantly against such exposure before others, especially in this place where they held power beyond measure and yet still sought answers. Usold's form shimmered slightly, as if mirroring his internal reflections, now visible within their bond despite physical distance imposed here by necessity. "And your heart beats differently," she murmured softly, more to herself than anyone else present, but David caught the essence of it regardless, even through this alien language barrier that had somehow already dissolved between them beneath layers of profound connection forged amidst turmoil. The court's hushed silence stretched on. Delegates shifted ever so slightly in their seats, as if sensing something significant yet unspoken hanging between these two, now across space and time condensed into one pivotal moment within Crystal Court. David knew he hadn't finished speaking, but felt his throat tighten. Emotions, threatening to overwhelm him again despite careful preparation for this confrontation. He took another breath before forcing himself onwards, though it was becoming increasingly difficult given the weight of truth he carried forward here among these ethereal beings who still could not fully comprehend such finite losses within their endless cycles. And yet David began hesitantly, but with renewed determination, "There is more." He paused again, as if gathering strength. His eyes flickered uncertainly for a brief moment before meeting Ushold's, once more deeply reflecting his own internal struggle through her empathetic gaze, now understanding far more than mere words could convey. "There are things I fear," David admitted haltingly yet with growing conviction beneath this shared silence. "Not just your brilliance and timeless wisdom, but also the depth of emotions. You feel compassion, curiosity." His voice trembled slightly, though he pressed onward despite initial fears, now slowly giving way to something more powerful still simmering below surface calm. "I have lost much," David continued quietly yet with unwavering resolve, "and I am scared." A collective murmur rippled through the court at this unexpected admission from one of their most steadfast allies. Even Ushold's form shimmered slightly in reflection, now fully acknowledging depths she herself did not truly understand until faced directly. David met her gaze once more, finding strength within it despite everything that separated them fundamentally as beings, and yet brought closer now by shared human vulnerability amidst alien certainty. "We fear what we don't understand," David concluded quietly but firmly, "and I have come to see you are beyond understanding for most." And he's not done. David's breath caught as he took another step forward, his shoes barely making a sound on the crystalline floor of Crystal Court. The room was vast and filled with an ethereal light that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once. He felt Ushold's gaze upon him. It was like being seen through, a feeling both disconcerting and oddly comforting. "You are eternal here," David began, his voice steady despite the emotions roiling beneath the surface of his composure. "Your essence unchanged through millennia." His eyes flickered briefly to the ethery delegates around them, their forms shimmering in a spectrum of colors that seemed to pulse with their collective thoughts and feelings. Ushold's form rippled slightly, as if mirroring David's internal reflections, now visible beneath layers of professional reserve he usually maintained so vigilantly against such exposure before others, especially here where they held power beyond measure. "And your heart beats differently," she murmured softly, more to herself than anyone else present, but the sound carried across the room. The court's hushed silence stretched on. Delegates shifted ever so slightly in their seats, as if sensing something significant yet unspoken hanging between these two, now across space and time condensed into one pivotal moment within Crystal Court. The air was cool, with a faint hum that reverberated through David's bones, almost like the pulse of an ancient heart. David knew he hadn't finished speaking, but felt his throat tighten, emotions threatening to overwhelm him again despite careful preparation for this confrontation. He took another breath before forcing himself onwards, though it was becoming increasingly difficult given the weight of truth he carried forward here among these ethereal beings who still could not fully comprehend such finite losses within their endless cycles. And yet David began hesitantly, but with renewed determination, "There is more." He paused again, as if gathering strength. His eyes flickered uncertainly for a brief moment before meeting Ushold's, once more deeply reflecting his own internal struggle through her empathetic gaze, now understanding far more than mere words could convey. "There are things I fear," David admitted haltingly yet with growing conviction beneath this shared silence. "Not just your brilliance and timeless wisdom, but also the depth of emotions. You feel compassion, curiosity. His voice trembled slightly, though he pressed onward despite initial fears, now slowly giving way to something more powerful still simmering below surface calm. "I have lost much," David continued quietly yet with unwavering resolve, "and I am scared." A collective murmur rippled through the court at this unexpected admission from one of their most steadfast allies. Even Ushold's form shimmered slightly, in reflection now fully acknowledging depths she herself did not truly understand until faced directly. David met her gaze once more, finding strength within it despite everything that separated them fundamentally as beings, and yet brought closer now by shared human vulnerability. Amidst alien certainty, his eyes darted to the intricate patterns, etc., head into the walls of crystal courtesans that seemed to shift and change before his very eyes with each passing moment. "We fear what we don't understand," David concluded quietly but firmly, "and I have come to see you are beyond understanding for most." He paused, drawing in another breath, feeling an unexpected weight lifting from his shoulders as the words hung between them. Ushold's form flickered more intensely now, her translucent body shimmering with a spectrum of colors that seemed almost chaotic and yet held a profound order. "David," she began, her voice soft but carrying through every corner of Crystal Court. It was the first time she had used his name in such an intimate way. "I avoid you because..." David hesitated for just a moment, gathering the courage to speak what he knew would be most difficult and yet somehow necessary now that this delicate thread of truth had been drawn so tightly between them. "Every time I see you," he continued steadily, though trembling still within him, "I want to stay." His voice broke slightly, but he pressed on despite it, feeling a strange sense of relief with each word that slipped past his lips and into the silent room around them. "And I buried someone I wanted to stay with." The court was dead quiet now. No sound could be heard, except for David's own words cutting through the air like sharp knives against silence. "I avoid you because hope is the most painful thing a human can carry." He paused, swallowing hard, feeling his heart ache as much as it had when he first learned of her loss years ago. "And you make me hope." Dead silence fell over Crystal Court. Even the faint hum seemed to stop for just that moment before returning with renewed intensity. Ushold's form flickered again, but in a way David recognized Noah's, if she was being touched by something new, unfamiliar yet strangely compelling within her essence. It made him hesitate momentarily because never had he seen anything like it from one of the Aetheri. "No one," Ushold finally whispered after what felt like an eternity stretching between them, "has spoken to me this way." Her voice held a quality David couldn't quite place, both sorrowful and intrigued, as if she was looking into something deeply foreign, yet undeniably beautiful within her own alien heart. The thought of it nearly overwhelmed him with its strangeness and beauty. "Court dismissed," came the quiet command from Ushold, still standing perfectly straight before them all, but David could see now that even she was shifting internally in ways none had ever seen. The delegates around them began to stir as if reluctantly breaking away from this unique moment shared between ambassador and arbiter. But David did not move just yet. He stayed rooted where he stood, feeling the weight of words spoken lingering heavily within him. Ushold turned her gaze directly towards David, their eyes meeting across the silent room once more, each carrying a depth far beyond what any human or Aetheri had ever experienced together before this moment. He saw in her reflection now something akin to yearning. It was an emotion she did not understand, but felt compelled by nonetheless. And then, without another word spoken between them, Ushold turned and left the court with grace that could only be called ethereal, leaving David alone amidst whispers that seemed both familiar and strange within his ears now. "Andy Court dismissed." Ushold stares at David, then leaves without a word. The gardens of the Etheria embassy stretched out like a celestial tapestry under the cool night sky. Starlight filtered through ethereal trees that seemed to float rather than grow from the ground. Each leaf shimmered and sparkled in hues David couldn't place, colors beyond human vision mixed with faint, melodic hums that danced in his ears. David sat on an intricately carved bench at one end of the garden, hands clasped tightly around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. The air was crisp, but not biting, and it carried within its chill a whispering wind that touched David's skin like tiny pinpricks of static electricity. Around him were soft, luminescent flowers whose petals glowed in waves of soft blue and green. They pulsed gently with each breath he took, as if the garden itself was breathing along with him. He had been sitting there for hours, his mind replaying every moment from earlier that day when Ushold's court dismissed. "I avoid you because," David whispered to himself now, repeating her words back in his head. "I want to stay." His voice cracked as the weight of truth landed heavily on his heart once more. The silence around him pressed in tight and thick like a shroud, reminding him he was alone with only the stars for company. And then she appeared, Ushold, dressed formally this time, no robes or insignia to indicate her standing amongst them all. Instead, she stood as simply herself, a figure of ethereal grace whose translucent form seemed to shimmer like starlight in motion. She moved through the garden almost still and light until she was beside David's bench. "David," Ushold said softly, breaking into his solitude. Her voice held a quality that caught him off guard. There was no title now, just her name spoken with an intimacy he couldn't quite comprehend from one of the Etheria. "What are you doing here?" He didn't mean it to sound so harsh, but words sometimes betrayed emotions, even when they tried not to. "I could ask the same," she replied gently, "especially in your capacity as ambassador." But there was something different about her tone now, a soft curiosity that pulled at him like gravity. David's gaze moved from the garden beyond back towards Ushold, finding himself looking directly into those vast galaxy-like eyes of hers. "I thought, maybe, I had lost everything worth holding on to." Ushold's form flickered slightly, a response he recognized more than ever before after their exchange in Crystal Court. She hesitated for a moment, as if considering her next words carefully. "And yet here you are," she murmured, almost to herself rather than him, "in this place where so much is different from your world." He sighed deeply and looked away again toward the gardens. The soft hums of life in the plants seemed louder now. They sang a symphony that David felt more than heard, a song about beginnings and endings intertwined. "I used to think hope was something I needed," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly through their quiet sanctuary. "Now, it feels like something that will hurt me again if I let myself believe in it." Ushold's form shifted slightly, almost as though she leaned closer despite there being no physical space between them. "Tell me about hope," she said softly, after what felt like an eternity of silence from both sides. The air around her seemed to shimmer with a strange energy David couldn't quite grasp, some sort of raw emotion he had never seen or sensed before in any Etheria, let alone their highest judge. David took a deep breath and tried to pull his thoughts back together. "Hope is painful," he began slowly but steadily, looking into her eyes once more now that the conversation seemed to have shifted gears entirely. It felt like standing on thin ice over an abyss of emotions, neither one fully understood yet dared to explore. He continued, "It's beautiful and terrifying all at once." He described it further, how hope made him feel alive again after every loss, How each time he had believed in something greater than himself, only he ended with that belief shattering into a million pieces under the cold feet of reality. But still, even as his heart clenched painfully around those memories, there was this strange, stubborn yearning to hold on to hope anyway. "I think," Cussold's voice interrupted gently but firmly, causing him to look back at her immediately, "I might understand that feeling." A flicker crossed over her translucent form now, a subtle change in hue and texture, as if she were processing something entirely new within herself, some strange emotion or sensation he had never seen stir beneath the surface of an ether before. "It's around you," Ushold continued softly. "This hope." Her voice was almost reverent, like tasting wine for the first time or seeing a sunset through eyes long blind and suddenly gifted sight once more. David finally met her gaze directly, then really looked at her as she sat beside him now, rather than just facing each other across formal distances of power or protocol. He saw something there he didn't quite understand yet. It was like looking into galaxies that held stories far beyond stars, vast histories whispered in starlight and shadowed edges. Puzzled, David began almost tentatively, after a moment's pause from both sides where words seemed to falter on the brink of new discoveries or realizations neither knew how to name just yet. "Say it again." Her name felt foreign on his lips now, carrying weight that had never been there before between them. No titles or formalities, but simply her essence and identity. "Ushold," he repeated more confidently this time, as if testing the resonance of those syllables in the air around him and through her being. "My name," she mirrored back to him with an intensity in her eyes that made his breath catch momentarily. "Say it again." This time when David spoke her name, there was no hesitation, only a clarity and honesty born from depths neither could fully grasp but felt compelled by nonetheless. "Andy Ushold," she said again. "My name." No title. David stood at the entrance of the grand courtroom within Ethery Prime's central government complex, his dark skin stark against the translucent walls that shimmered like a distant nebula seen through a telescope. The room was vast and imposing, filled with delicate latticework carved from what appeared to be solidified starlight, its effete strut glinting in the ambient light of countless small stars embedded into the structure's framework. The air was cool, but not cold here, carrying an indefinable scent that reminded him vaguely of rain on dry grass back home. This space had been designed for grandeur and reverence, yet now it felt charged with anticipation as murmurs spread like whispers across a crowded beach during high tide. The rumors swirled around David, speculations ranging from scandal to revolution. A guard approached, his figure blending seamlessly into the semi-translucent walls until he was clearly in front of the ambassador. "Your presence is requested," the guard said formally, without any hint of emotion, bowing slightly before turning and leading David down a long corridor lined with soft glowing lights that cast no shadows. The courtroom itself had grown crowded since his last visit here. Dignitaries from across ethery space stood in groups, chatting quietly or simply waiting intently. Yet amidst the crowd, he could feel Ushold's presence, like an invisible hand guiding him forward through a sea of other hands reaching out, but never quite touching. When David finally entered what used to be his most hated room within this alien city, eyes turned toward him with equal parts curiosity and disdain. He felt them all weighing in on the unspoken question that seemed to float above their heads. What would become of Earth's ambassador now? Atop a raised platform along one wall stood Ushold, her form nearly blending into the backdrop, if not for the way she cast faint shadows across the room despite being entirely transparent. Her iced galaxies within were fixed on him as he made his cautious approach. "Welcome," Ushold said softly when David reached an appropriate stopping distance before addressing the court. "Ambassador Okonkwo, you are here to answer for actions considered inappropriate by your own government and ours." David's heart clenched at this formality, despite knowing it was coming. Had expected exile or worse banishment back home, with his diplomatic career ruined by one slip of humanity. But as he looked around the room now filled not just with Aetheri, but also representatives from other worlds, their gazes locked on him and Ushold like they were watching a cosmic dance unfold right before them. "Before we proceed," Ushold continued after only moments of silence had stretched taut between speaker and audience alike, "I have something to say first." David felt his breath hitch as the entire court fell silent once more, even sharper than when had walked in moments ago. The tension was palpable. It clung heavily like fog settling over a meadow at dawn. 3,000 years, I judged others," Ushold began slowly, but with an unyielding cadence that made every word resonate through the room despite how softly they were spoken. "Never felt." David's eyes widened slightly as he looked up from where his gaze had dropped briefly upon hearing those words that struck a chord in ways he hadn't anticipated. "This human," she continued, nodding subtly toward him, "taught me something new." Her form shimmered ever so faintly now like the sun breaking through cloud cover, only to be obscured again almost immediately. "I don't know what this becomes," she admitted softly, but with an unflinching honesty that felt deeply personal despite being said aloud for all ears. The courtroom was silent once more, as if holding its collective breath in anticipation of whatever Ushold might do next, a notion so foreign to any interaction David had ever witnessed here, he couldn't quite process it yet. Then she moved slowly, descending from her raised platform and stepping towards him across the floor that seemed almost alive with light dancing underfoot. It was unprecedented, this action of leaving judgment behind in favor of something else entirely. Whatever emotions or sensations Ushold now carried within her had clearly overcome centuries of cold dispassion. When she reached David's side, though, instead of stopping directly next to him like a formal gesture might suggest, she simply stood there looking down at his hand. And then it happened. Ushold took David's hand in hers, the semi-translucent form melding gently with his own solid one, as if trying to bridge gaps no words could reach. It was an intimate act here among their people, a symbol of closeness that defied formalities and court protocol entirely. David felt every eye upon them again, but more importantly, he saw Ushold's icy-held galaxies now swirling within themselves rather than mere reflections thereof. Her gaze shifted to meet his directly, then both acknowledging and questioning him at once through sheer force of will alone it seemed. "Stay," she asked quietly, a question as much invitation for what neither fully understood yet felt compelled towards nonetheless. David looked down briefly, fingers clutching the pocket where had placed his wedding ring earlier today upon returning home from a walk together. The weight there was heavy despite its small size, memories of past love and loss lingering just beneath his breath. He finally met her gaze again, then letting go very slowly but steadily too, as if testing the waters before diving headfirst into something unknown yet compellingly necessary for some reason he couldn't quite articulate beyond instinctual need itself now. "Stay," she repeated softly, pulling him back from thoughts that threatened to drag them both down into darker places unworthy of whatever this moment promised between them instead. David looked at her one more time, truly seeing Usold in ways no one else ever had before or likely would again, their bond unique and unspoken though felt with every fiber connecting them now. Then he nodded, voice steady, if slightly rough around edges from emotion barely held back yet ready to face whatever came next because of those same feelings. "For you," David said quietly but firmly, as he released the ring completely into his pocket before returning his hand's position beside hers once more. "It'll stay." The room seemed to exhale collectively. At that moment, tension breaking in waves across faces turned towards this couple now standing side by side, rather than formal positions of protocol and judgment. And then it was over. Usold looked up from their hands back toward the assembled crowd behind them, as if inviting further action or commentary, but David felt her hand tighten slightly around his own, even as he sensed the court's eyes shifting away again towards other matters now that this singular moment had been observed fully for all present. They turned to face forward then, ambassador and high arbiter, no longer bound by titles alone, but newly connected in ways neither quite understood yet knew they must explore further together. The cold ambassador and the eternal arbiter both learning once more what it meant to feel beyond formalities, hearts open again despite scars that still stung sharply from past losses each carried within themselves. The cold ambassador and the eternal arbiter both learning to feel again.